Welcome, Danny. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this new episode of our expert interview series. My name is Khalil Jahshan. I'm Executive Director of Arab Center, Washington, D.C. I would like to go ahead and dive into the art of conversation with my friend, our guest today, special guest of honor, Daniel Seidemann, who is an attorney, an Israeli attorney, specializing in legal and public issues, particularly focusing on East Jerusalem and Israeli-Palestinian relations in general. He doesn't need an introduction for those of you who are well versed into the Palestinian issue or Palestinian-Israeli relations in general. He's the founder of Terrestrial Jerusalem, an authoritative NGO that works towards a political resolution to the question of Jerusalem that it deems central, actually, to any serious attempt at resolving the Arab-Israeli conflict. Since 1991, Danny has worked on issues and cases related to government and municipal policies and practices, representing Israeli and Palestinian residents of Jerusalem before planning boards within the city government and other national agencies of the government. Key cases that are well known to most of you probably, although they're probably going back in history in light of current day developments, we tend to kind of forget. But he was involved in the takeover of Palestinian properties in Silwan, defending the owners of the land at the time, the legality of the Har Homa expropriation town plan, the Ras Al Amoud town plan, the closing of Orient House that became a big issue at the time, and many cases of administrative demolition orders, denial of freedom of education in East Jerusalem, etc. He has argued more than 20 Jerusalem-related cases before the Israeli Supreme Court. Danny, welcome.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Let me start with the basic question. I hear you quite often use the term, which is very intriguing and very interesting. You said it even yesterday. It's all about Jerusalem. What do you mean it's all about Jerusalem? I mean, can you reduce this complicated conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, or the Arab-Israeli conflict, into the issue of a city, or is it kind of the prototype of this conflict in a way?
The conflict is a complex one. It is multi-tiered. There's a territorial dimension to it. How, if at all, we're going to divide this tortured piece of land between two national collectives, the Israeli people and the Palestinian people. In the introduction that you presented, which is entirely accurate, there was one word, occupation. Only after working on this for 30 years do I understand that what I have been working on is ending occupation. So Jerusalem has the territorial dimension, but Jerusalem is also a radioactive issue, because the Palestinian people would not be the Palestinian without Al-Quds. Wouldn't be the same people. And one of the gifts that Jerusalem has given me is to familiarize me with the way Palestinians, not only my friends and neighbors in Jerusalem, but Palestinians in the West Bank, in Gaza, the special connection between Gaza and Jerusalem is something that I've learned. And the same applies to the Jewish people. You know, we would not be who we are were it not Jerusalem. And in recent years, Jerusalem has been radicalized. The events have been driven by religious pyromaniacs, the religious movements that weaponize faith and set off a trajectory of a religious war that led us to Gaza. And it led us to Gaza because the religious extremes say it's all ours. It's not yours. You have no business being here. It's exclusionary and incendiary. And it has become prominent because we, who are not religious pyromaniacs, some of us are people of faith, we didn't fight back. We didn't offer a counter paradigm. Jerusalem is Jerusalem when it speaks in its multiple voices. We've put together a database of all of the sacred sites in and around the old city. It's 3 square miles, 700 holy sites.
To all three religions.
All 3 religions. And that is the Jerusalem that is under assault. That is what occupation is undermining. And the character of Jerusalem is at risk. You know, our racist minister of internal security, or what, national security, Ben-Gvir, thug, terrorist, went to Al-Aqsa a month ago. And he said before going up, I've got to go to Al-Aqsa because our soldiers in Gaza say that every time they enter a Palestinian home, there's a picture on the wall of Al-Aqsa. I was delighted by that because I know and respect that Al-Aqsa is a critical part of Palestinian identity and throughout the Muslim world, but especially for the Palestinians. Correct me if I'm wrong. The Palestinian population, who has been savaged by this horrible carnage, unspeakable, are probably the most devout Palestinian community in terms of Islam that I'm aware of. And they're the ones who will never see Al-Aqsa. And the fact that Al-Aqsa is inaccessible to the millions of Palestinians in Gaza for whom Al-Aqsa is important is a stain on Israel. It's a stain on occupation. My goal is that any Palestinian will be able to access and go to pray, or not to pray and express respect for the site without my permission. And that's not the case, and that's achievable.
And the person you mentioned, Ben-Gvir, who's offended by, in a way, this attachment, or provoked by this attachment by somebody else or another religion, he doesn't see the equivalence. I mean, he will sit with you maybe for hours debating, we Jews over history, we were deprived of access to Jerusalem, but he doesn't see that he is depriving another religion, another culture, of access to its holy places too.
Look, on the one hand, he's not alone. And Jerusalem, there is a frenzy of mutual denial. You were never here. The difference is that Ben-Gvir is the power, and the others are not. Ben-Gvir goes to the Mount in an act of ultra-nationalist triumphalism. I've got a friend who was the director of the Al-Aqsa Museum in the 1980s. And he would tell me there were hundreds of Israelis coming every day. Many of them were religious. They visited the mosques and they visited the museum. They weren't escorted by the police. They weren't escorted by the Waqf guards because they came as guests. And they respected the decorum of the site, as should be. Today, Ben-Gvir and the Temple Mount Wupper, they're not guests. And they say it in as many words. We're here to say, you are guests. We're the landlord. And we're here to collect the rent. And we may be instituting eviction proceedings against you. It is this vile, ultranationalist triumphalism.
Let me ask you, this character of the current group governing Israel. You've been in the city now for what?
50 years.
50 years, 51 years, 52 years. What has changed, and specifically under this government with Netanyahu and his partners like Ben Gvir and Smotrich and others?
Less has changed than meets the eye, but much has changed. I'll start on the third day of the 67 war. On the second day, our legendary Minister of Defense went to Mount Scopus and looked over Haram al-Sharif and Al-Aqsa, and he muttered, "Who the hell needs these Vaticans?" He didn't want responsibility for the holy sites in Jerusalem. 24 hours later, Israel took them out. And 10 o'clock in the morning, and he went there 2 o'clock in the afternoon, 4 hours later, and he saw flags, Israeli flags flying from the mosques. And he barked, "Take those down and never put them up again. We don't need a holy war." And then he went on camera and said, "The Jewish people has returned to our most sacred sites, and we will never take leave of them again." Now, this was the guy who 24 hours earlier was saying, "I don't want this." Secular, it's an indication. First of all, what he did with the flags was the birth of the status quo. And it was an indication that even in the heat of battle, the significance of the war was transformed to a territorial defensive battle, whatever you interpret it, into a war of biblical salvation. And that has grown over time. What began as a fringe movement, some would say a lunatic fringe, about transforming Al-Aqsa into a Jewish site, is no longer fringe. They're not a majority in the government, but they're there. They're in the government. And Netanyahu, who in the past was risk averse, he did a pretty good job in respecting the Muslim equities in the Waqf until 5 years ago. And that is gone. You know, there's something that my Israeli compatriots fail to understand. Me and I think much of my generation considered Netanyahu's decision create a status quo was one of the wisest decisions Israel made after 1967. It doesn't make Al-Aqsa less occupied, but it was very wise. For the members of this government, that is the most colossal mistake that was made by Israel since 1948, the status quo. There is a divine plan, and that divine plan is the restoration of ancient Jerusalem. There's continuity between the first and second Jewish commonwealths 2,000 years ago. And this is their opportunity to reverse Dayan's decision and to demonstrate this is ours. I would argue that a considerable part of the seeds of this horrible war in Gaza were planted by the religious radicalization in Israel.
I've been in that tunnel under the Wailing Wall,
So have I.
and I saw that prototype of the Temple Mount, quote unquote, and that electronically operated display that they had in there. Is that their political objective now? I mean, it's one thing to have it for tourist attraction. It's another thing to turn it into a political objective, isn't it?
It's fascinating. Jerusalem had a great geographical historian, Meron Ben-Venisti, who passed away a few years ago, and he has a description of this subterranean world. It starts at the bottom of the hill at the pool of Siloam in Silwan, and it tunnels under Palestinian homes and under the ramparts of the old city and continues there to the Via Dolorosa. And they're pushing to get to the Damascus Gate. A few years ago, I was just taking a look at what's happening in the old city. And it turns out that the settlers who are living in the Muslim quarter, and they've got kids, their kids walk home via the roofs of the old city, especially of the Shuk. And I saw a young guy, a kid, 7 years old, talking to his 5-year-old sister, "Get up here onto the roof, or we're going to take you home on the street via the danger." Now, that's the perception. The settlers have created a subterranean world, which is a fictitious Disneyland. It's the crass Disneyfication of Jerusalem. And they are doing it, among else, so they don't have to see the 400,000 Palestinians who are living above ground. And they go home on the rooftops where they don't see Palestinians. So there is an expression in this radicalization of Jerusalem of making Palestinians disappear. It's a cognitive Nakba.
Wow. Today, as we speak, June 2024, what is left of the status quo, and where does the Waqf fit? Is it still alive?
One has to speak with caution about this subject because people tend to speak irresponsibly. And I've monitored the status quo for 30 years without quite knowing what the definition is, because there are a number of definitions. The core of the status quo is Al-Aqsa, and by saying Al-Aqsa, I'm not talking only about the structure, I'm talking about the entire esplanade and the 37 Muslim holy sites on the esplanade. It's a place of worship for Muslims, exclusively. It is also open to the dignified and respectful visits of non-Muslims in coordination with the Waqf and in a manner that's appropriate to the decorum on the site. That status quo has been eroded. Hasn't collapsed, but it's been eroded. And the erosion of the status quo at Al-Aqsa, by polling in the Arab world, and I don't dare compete with your knowledge, why did the war break out in Gaza? It's Al-Aqsa, the threat to Al-Aqsa. Now, often the threat to Al-Aqsa is exaggerated. It's propaganda. No, we are not burrowing under Al-Aqsa. But we're doing other things. There is Jewish prayer on the Mount. And that didn't...
In violation of the status quo.
In violation of the status quo. And it's been a trend. The Temple Mount movement people would start saying silent prayers, and then they would mumble the prayers, and then they brought in prayer books, and they said, take no prayer books. So they read it from their cell phones, and it's organized every day. Now, Israel is violating the status quo, and I say that with deep regret. One of my goals, it hasn't collapsed. The basic rules are still there. But 10 years ago, Al-Aqsa was the least occupied place in Jerusalem. Today, it's the most occupied place in Jerusalem. There are a bunch of groups who are discussing, mostly my age, with a great future in back of us, are discussing what to do the day after. And I'm not joining those discussions. It's beyond my pay grade. But one thing I'm certain of, that the equilibrium has to be restored at Al-Aqsa. And that means restoring the autonomous authorities of the Waqf and recognizing those authorities. I would hope that the recalibration of the status quo would be a major goal.
Is that missing equity the missing ingredient in this whole bonanza of normalization that they are talking about these days?
I was even more socially unacceptable than I usually am when I expressed grave reservations of normalization. Now, I'm a Zionist. It's not popular to say that, but my interpretation is one I live comfortably with. I want the Jewish people to assume a rightful place among the family of nations. That's my Zionism. But normalization was used as a way to bypass Palestinian and occupation. The greatest threat to Israel at the moment is Netanyahu. But over time, it's the reality that Netanyahu has created or strengthened, and that is occupation. Israel will end occupation together with Palestinians, or occupation will be the end of us. So together, the core of the conflict at Al-Aqsa, which is under occupation, and the diminished humanity of Palestinians that is expressed in occupation, is a disease that we have to get rid of. And the disease of I don't compare, I'm an occupier. My Palestinian friends across town are occupied. I'm their occupier. I never forget that. But occupation is a disease that's infecting both people. And we will begin to heal when occupation ends. Look at the Oslo process, which I supported, but was abused and transformed into something that perpetuates occupation. And my Palestinian friends point out to me that after Oslo, East Jerusalem and the West Bank became more occupied and not less occupied. So if you can have the creeping annexation and occupation, you can also deoccupy. Deoccupy is what people used to call confidence building measures, which I consider to be a profanity. The understanding until this day has been confidence building measures. We will give material benefits to the Palestinians, and they in will return waive their national identity. No. Deoccupation is addressing the deficit in dignity and freedom. And it means that Palestinians, in recent years under Netanyahu, you asked what's different. Palestinians are in the grips of a concerted effort to denationalize the Palestinians of East Jerusalem, to Jaffaize them, a vestigial organ that with hummus. Okay? Palestinians of East Jerusalem are not for sale. Israeli policies are, we'll buy them with entitlements, and we'll break them with the Shabak. And buying and breaking will be able to handle this. No, there is no legitimate Palestinian political activity in Jerusalem. Anything that is more radical than a scout meeting is crushed by the police. And there have been scout meetings crushed by the police. I kid you not. Create the space. I don't know what my Palestinian friends will have to say when they organize politically, not as individuals, but as expression of a Palestinian national collective. There's no reason to deny that. This is not about security. When things are difficult, and they have been difficult often lately, I remember what the late great Faisal Husseini told me 2:00 in the morning when settlers were taking over a house in Silwan, and he was there and I was there, and we're trying to do something, and I was visibly shaken by what I was seeing, what was happening in Sheikh Jarrah. And Faisal said to me, Danny, it'll be okay. You Israelis are creating facts on the ground. We, the Palestinians, are the facts. Thank God for that. I mean, I don't want to live in a Jerusalem without my Palestinian friends. It won't be the same city.
Yeah. Let me conclude with this question. What you referred to as the shrinking Palestinian space in Jerusalem, do you see it as a national phenomena today? I mean, isn't there a shrinking Palestinian space for even Palestinians who are Israeli citizens in the 48 areas?
I agree with the first part, and I kind of disagree with the latter part. I say this with hesitation, but when the war broke out, the Palestinian citizens of Israel have displayed greater identification with Israel in word and in deed than we've ever seen before. It appears in the polls, but not only in the polls. No, I'm not making this into a caricature. The discrimination is there, the racism is there. But the Palestinian citizens of Israel see the savagery of October 7th. It's an attack on us. And it was, because there were so many Palestinian citizens of Israel among those slaughtered and those who are still in captivity. Across town, in East Jerusalem, that's not perceived as an assault. And there's no identification with Israel. And that's not an accusation. We're occupied. Now, go back to 1948. The Palestinian in Shfaram and the Palestinian in East Jerusalem were brother and sister. And today they perceive things, they're still connected. They still have family ties. They perceive things differently, which is an indication to me that Israeli democracy, which is in grave danger and deeply flawed, has been something of a success story with the Palestinian citizens of Israel. It has been a total, unsustainable failure with the Palestinians living in East Jerusalem. The occupation of East Jerusalem is destroying the character of Jerusalem. And the churches are feeling it, the environmentals, and we should be feeling it. Jerusalem will not be a free city until all of its residents will be free. I changed my life to live in Jerusalem. I learned a new language. I adopted a new culture, and I don't regret that. I understand the power of this magical city. But what I feel is no greater than what my friends in East Jerusalem feel. And my liberation depends on their liberation. I know I'm not occupied, they are. But this conflict will end in Jerusalem. It won't end at all. The good news is Jerusalem is a very wise city. Jerusalem is a wise city who treat its complexities with respect. Jewish, Arab, Israeli, Palestinian, Christian, Muslim, Jewish. Those who ignore it, Jerusalem is a very vindictive town. Ignore Jerusalem, and this I'm telling to my friends in the Arab world, ignore Jerusalem and you will pay. Jerusalem can be ignored only at great peril to those who ignore it. What's happening in Jerusalem today is spilling over into the streets of Paris and London, where relations among Jews, Muslims have become toxic. That will heal most effectively when Jerusalem heals. It's not a local issue. And Jerusalem knows how to do it. We just need the right leadership. That will not happen until Netanyahu is gone. And once he's gone, we'll have our work cut out for us. But we have to let Jerusalem be Jerusalem. If we do so, we will progress in addressing the core of this conflict.
Kind of time to end this very, very interesting and provocative conversation. And that's essentially what the purpose of the art of conversation is to provoke and to generate some thinking in terms of how we all look at issues that are of concern to us. Danny, thank you so much for being with us today.
I'm honored to be able to do this.
Thank you.
The fact that we can discuss things like this is something that I never imagined that would be possible. And now it's second nature.
Yeah.
And that too is a cause for hope.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Ladies and gentlemen, see you in a future session with other guests at Arab Center, Washington, D.C. Thank you for your attention.